Devil on the Cross is a political allegorical novel originally written in Gikuyu and later translated into English by Ngũgĩ himself. It tells the story of Thiong'o, a young Kenyan woman from Nairobi, as she struggles against the forces of neo-colonialism, capitalism, gender oppression, and cultural alienation. The novel combines realism, satire, and oral storytelling techniques to expose the exploitation of the poor by a corrupt elite. The novel opens with an unusual narrative device. The narrator claims to have heard the story from a man on a bus, a storytelling technique rooted in African oral traditions. The story then shifts to Thiong'o, who is evicted from her apartment, has lost her job due to sexual harassment, and is contemplating suicide. She receives an invitation to a devil's feast in the fictional town of Ilmorog, a symbolic event where the country's wealth thieves and exploiters will gather to boast about their crimes. Intrigued and desperate for change, Thiong'o boards a matatu, shared minibus, to Ilmorog, along with other passengers who also reflect different aspects of Kenyan society: workers, peasants, intellectuals, and traditional figures. As the matatu travels, the passengers engage in debate and storytelling, discussing the state of the nation, corruption, class struggle, and the role of foreign powers in Kenya's economic oppression. These conversations expose how Kenya's independence has not brought true liberation, as the local bourgeoisie now acts as agents of exploitation on behalf of global capitalism. In Ilmorog, the Devil's Feast takes place, a grotesque competition of thieves, where businessmen brag about how they exploit workers, sell out to foreign corporations, and enrich themselves at the expense of the poor. This macabre satire lays bare the hypocrisy and greed of the ruling class, portraying them as literal demons feeding on the blood of the masses. Thiong'o, after experiencing humiliation, violence, and disillusionment, undergoes a transformation. She becomes a symbol of resistance, rejecting victimhood and reclaiming her dignity. By the end of the novel, she returns to Nairobi armed and empowered, determined to fight back against the forces that have oppressed her and her people. Analysis. 1. Neo-colonialism and class struggle. At its core, Devil on the Cross is a scathing critique of neo-colonialism, the continued domination of post-independence African nations by foreign powers and multinational corporations, facilitated by a corrupt local elite. Ngũgĩ shows that political independence has done little to change the material conditions of ordinary Kenyans. The land is still owned by a few, wealth is concentrated in the hands of an elite, and foreign interests dictate national policy. The devils in the story are not mythological beings but capitalists, politicians, and foreign investors who exploit Kenya's resources and people. The Devil's Feast allegorizes this systemic exploitation in exaggerated, grotesque terms, but the message is deadly serious. The true enemies of freedom are not outside invaders, but internal collaborators who profit from betrayal. 2. Feminism and Thiong'o's transformation. Thiong'o's journey is both personal and political. She begins the novel as a victim, rejected by society, used by powerful men, and marginalized for being a woman. Her story reflects the gendered nature of oppression in post-colonial Africa, where women often suffer doubly, as members of the working class and as targets of patriarchal control. However, Thiong'o undergoes one of the most powerful character transformations in African literature. Through her experiences and interactions with others, she becomes conscious of her worth and her oppression. She educates herself, reclaims her body and voice, and eventually takes up arms against injustice. Her final act of defiance, killing those who have abused power, can be interpreted as both revolutionary and symbolic, an assertion that oppressed people must rise and confront their tormentors if change is to come. 3. Satire and allegory. Ngũgĩ employs satire and allegory throughout the novel to dramatize the absurdity and horror of neo-colonial Kenya. The Devil's Feast is a nightmarish event where corruption is celebrated and exploitation is rewarded. The participants' bragging is so exaggerated that it borders on the surreal, yet it effectively exposes the depths of systemic greed. Through this allegory, Ngũgĩ strips away the facade of respectability from the capitalist class and reveals them as monsters feeding off human suffering. He turns the typical business conference into a parody of evil, highlighting the moral bankruptcy of Kenya's post-independence elite. This style, mixing folklore, exaggeration, and hyperbole, makes the political message accessible and memorable, in keeping with Ngũgĩ's desire to write for and uplift the common people. 4. Oral tradition and revolutionary language. The structure of the novel borrows heavily from oral storytelling, a hallmark of African literature. The use of a frame narrative, communal dialogues on the bus, and storytelling within storytelling mimics the rhythms of traditional oral performance, encouraging readers to think collectively. Ngũgĩ's decision to originally write the novel in Gikuyu, rather than English, was a radical act. It reflects his commitment to linguistic decolonization, asserting that African stories must be told in African languages to preserve cultural identity and resist intellectual domination. In this sense, Devil on the Cross is not just a story, it is a political tool, meant to educate, mobilize, and inspire the oppressed to resist. 5. The role of the matatu. The matatu, public minibus, is more than a means of transport. It is a symbol of grassroots Kenyan society, chaotic, communal, noisy, and alive. The conversations aboard the matatu represent a mini parliament of the people, where ideas are debated, truths are shared, and falsehoods are exposed. By setting much of the novel on this moving vehicle, Ngũgĩ creates a dynamic, mobile metaphor for social change. The matatu carries Waringa, and by extension, the reader, toward both revelation and revolution. Conclusion. Devil on the Cross is a bold, angry, and visionary novel that speaks truth to power. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o uses Waringa's story and the satirical device of the Devil's Feast to denounce neo-colonial capitalism, patriarchy, and cultural alienation in post-independence Kenya. More than just a literary work, the novel functions as a political statement and a call to arms. It urges ordinary people to recognize the systems that oppress them and to take collective action to reclaim their dignity, land, and future. Waringa's transformation from passive victim to empowered resistor embodies the message of the novel. The oppressed must become the agents of their own liberation. Ngũgĩ's integration of traditional storytelling, revolutionary language, and radical politics makes Devil on the Cross one of the most important texts in African literature. It is not merely a cry of protest but a vision of liberation, one rooted in the voice of the people, the power of culture, and the dream of a just society.